what if I told you that giving people less time to do something many times will actually improve the quality of their work, and that you can use the same trick on yourself to improve your life?
I thought I was the only person who did that. You mean it's actually a technique?
Well, yes, and before I explain the technique, I need to talk about this amazing law called Parkinson's law,
Parkinson's law.
which says that work expands to fill all available time.
Yes.
So obviously a guy called Parkinson, Cyril Parkinson, came up with this law in 1955,
Okay.
and he was looking at bureaucracies, and he noticed that whatever amount of time you give them to do something, they will take all that time. The same thing, you could give them 1 week, you could give them 1 month, you could give them 6 months, and they will take exactly the amount of time given to them, right?
Okay.
So for example, between 1914 and 1928, the British Admiralty, which is the bureaucracy that handles their navy, right? The staff increased by 78%, even though the number of ships reduced, the personnel being managed reduced, but the bureaucracy increased by 78% with no reduction in time, right?
Listen, that's the bureaucracy, and I kind of understand why that would happen.
Well, no, but over the years, people have found that this is true not just of bureaucracies, but everything, private companies and your own daily life.
Interesting. Now I'm trying to think of how I can use this to my advantage, because
Yes.
everything he says can be used to our advantage.
Right. So there is a lovely article by James Stainer, the director of engineering of Shopify. Okay. And the title is Parkinson's Law. It's real. So use it. Okay. Link is there in the description.
All right.
But the basic idea is that Parkinson's law is real.
Correct.
Right? Which means that if you give people some amount of time, they are going to take up all that time.
Yeah.
So instead, if you give them less time, they still manage to finish things on time, right?
Okay.
So give them deadlines and make them a little shorter than what they think, and things get done in a lot less time. And this is true not only of other people, but you can use self-imposed deadlines to use Parkinson's law, the reverse of Parkinson's law, against yourself, and it works.
So I know for a fact that this works for me.
Well, I will give you a list of people it works for.
Okay.
Tina Fey, great comedian, right? Her quote: "The show doesn't go on because it is ready. It goes on because it is 11:30. Brian Eno, one of the greats in music, and he's also one of the great music producers, says everything is an experiment until it has a deadline. That gives it a destination, a context, and a reason." Okay. Dave Barry, another great comedian.
Massive.
Like all writers, my greatest inspiration, my ultimate muse is a deadline. Okay. And Andy Gilbert says, give yourself a deadline to stop planning and to start taking action. By the way, you will realize this is the second line of Karmanye Vadikaraste also. Action is important. Okay. And most important, Steve Jobs. Real artists ship.
That is true. That is true. But here is the problem when real artists ship, and when real artists are given very tight deadlines, that the quality of work always suffers.
Yeah. Well, not really. Okay. But before we get into why not really, we need to understand why Parkinson's law happens.
Okay.
Right? So if you have a lot of time to do something, right, there is a lack of focus. Okay. There is procrastination, you sort of do other things, you get distracted, and of course the internet and social media has made that much worse, right?
Yeah.
Another problem is that most of us suffer from perfectionism. We're like, oh, I need to make it better. Oh, this is not good enough. I can't put this out as it is. Especially true of artists who never like any of the work they do, right? Like Tina Fey, Dave Barry already said.
Yeah.
Okay? There are a couple of other psychological factors which also affect this, called psychological time and self-handicapping. I'll talk about that later. But most importantly, scope creep, right? When you have a lot of time to do something, you want to make it better, you want to add more features to it, you want to do more with whatever you are doing, right? And this is especially true of artists like Tina Fey and Dave Barry already pointed out, but it is true of all of us.
Yeah, and see, the scope creep usually happens because you think of something that will add value to the
Yeah.
project or the product that you're making.
Yeah.
But my question is, how will just having a deadline fix it?
Yeah. There is a very important law
Okay.
in software programming, the agile and extreme programming movement from 25 years back,
Okay.
called YAGNI, YAGNI, which stands for you ain't gonna need it. So YAGNI says that a lot of things that we plan, oh, it should have this, it should do this, and this is also important, and this is also necessary. Later on, it turns out that most of those things were not necessary. You are not going to need them, right? So that principle says that launch with the minimum, and then you can add more things later, right? That is true of so many things that we do. Okay.
Yeah.
So James Steiner, the article I talked about, he points out that in any project, there is an iron triangle of scope, time, and resources. Okay. This is one of those trilemmas. We have done an episode on trilemmas, check it out. But basically what he says is that in any project, there is scope, what all needs to get done.
Correct.
There is resources, what resources you have to get it done.
Correct.
That includes budget, people, tools, etc. And there is the time you have to get it done.
Correct.
Right? Reducing the deadline is using this iron triangle to your advantage, right? If you reduce the time, you can't do it without changing one of the other things, right?
Correct.
Either you increase resources, which in most cases is not practical.
Correct.
So you end up reducing the scope. And because of YAGNI, most of the times that ends up being a good idea. And this is true not just of time. Okay. Over the years, they have found that Parkinson's law, which originally talked about work expands to fill all available time, applies to other things also. Like work expands to fill all available team members, work expands to use up the whole budget, and so on. Yeah. So by reducing these things, you avoid overallocation, you avoid analysis paralysis, and by removing the choice, right, you end up solving the problem which Voltaire had mentioned, right? Perfect is the enemy of good.
Okay.
Right? Okay. So you end up with something that is good enough, right?
Yeah.
But there is one more very important aspect of a deadline that I want to talk about. Okay. Which is that when there is a slightly challenging deadline, it makes physical changes to our body and our brain. Okay. See, our brain doesn't have a little digital clock inside, right?
True.
So any perception of time is actually controlled by our cerebellum and our basal ganglia and the dopamine that is flowing in there. Okay. Because of which you will notice that there are some times where an entire hour goes away and you don't even realize. And there are other times when 2 minutes seems like forever, right? Yeah. That's because that's psychological time, right? Because in those two situations, you had different amounts of dopamine going on, right?
Okay.
Now, mild stress, right, affects these things. And because of that, you focus, you have more time to do what you were trying to do.
Because stress is an anxiety response and our brains have evolved to focus more when there is an anxiety inducing factor. And
Absolutely, right? Because in the African savanna, a lion showing up makes you completely focus on solving this problem and ignore everything else, and time slows down so you can think more clearly, more sharply, you're more creative in solving problems. And now, instead of a lion, we use that same thing to get our next report done, right? So yeah, let me give a real world example of where this has been used to great effect.
Okay.
In SPACEX, Elon Musk would regularly give aggressive deadlines to his teams.
Okay.
And as a result, they would come up with creative solutions, and they have done things that pretty much nobody else could do. There's a link to a book review about SPACEX. Just take a look at that.
Yeah, but I can imagine the stress that it might have caused. So much stress. Because when Elon Musk tells you to do something in X amount of time, you have to do it, and that stress is going to kill you, very literally.
Yes, you are right. We have done an episode on how stress is killing you. Check it out. But yes, so stress can be bad for you. What we have found, what research has found, is that there is a inverted U curve of the effect of stress, right? When you have very little stress, you slack off. When a little stress is added to the system, then not only do you focus, not only do you work faster, but it has been shown that your creativity increases, right?
True.
But if you continue adding stress, then of course everything goes downhill and everything becomes bad, and you will actually have serious problems.
So
Right?
stress versus creativity. Stress increases, creativity increases up to a point, and then too much stress, creativity drops off.
Correct. Inverted U curve.
Okay.
Right? Another important thing
Hmm.
is that you do not want to put stress on the wrong kind of person. Not everybody can handle it. And some people, if you put stress on them, they are going to have mental health issues. They are going to have burnout,
Yeah.
which is a non-trivial physiological condition,
Yes.
which needs professional help. Right?
Absolutely.
Another thing that helps in this situation, again from James Steiner's article, is that let there be public appreciation of people hitting their deadlines, right? What he talks about is that if there is a company or a team where there is a weekly deadline schedule, and at the beginning of every week, every team publishes what all it got done in the last week, then at the end of every week, people want to do more things so that they can put it in the report, right? It gives them like a nice little dopamine hit.
Okay. Two things about that. One, there is the possibility of Goodhart's law appearing. We'll talk about that. But more importantly, I want to talk about the fact that this behavior does not replicate in some people.
Yeah.
And by some people, I mean the people who are living with ADHD. Because in ADHD, the notion of a completion of a task giving you a dopamine hit doesn't exist. For people who have ADHD, completing a task doesn't give them that dopamine hit. So a lot of times they need to develop other coping mechanisms that will replicate this behavior. So a lot of this deadline idea might not feel possible for you if you have ADHD, but that doesn't mean you can't leverage these ideas to incorporate into your daily ADHD life.
So yeah, I think it is important to point out that this is tricky. Okay, you have to do it right, and if you do it in a dumb way, it can lead to disaster. As you said, Goodhart's law applies, and people are going to try to game it. So you have to make sure that you don't use a very numbers-driven approach here.
Correct.
Second is that the managers running this need to be smart and sensitive enough to know which person to not push. There are probably, about 5 to 10% of the people on whom this will actually have the negative effect.
True.
Right? Third thing to keep in mind, right, is that, this sounds like goals, and we've done an episode on goals versus systems, saying goals are bad, systems are good, right? So make sure that the goals don't become the main thing, right? The system of having deadlines for your actions, that is important, right? Don't have deadlines for your goals.
Correct.
Okay. Again, that is, karmanyevadhikaraste also, right?
True.
But when you really think about it, there are famous techniques which incorporate all of this properly, right?
Like?
One technique is called the Pomodoro technique. Read up about it, but the basic idea is it says that when you want to do something, you break it up into little chunks. A chunk should be something that you can do in 20-25 minutes.
Correct.
Then you literally start a 25-minute clock and you work for 25 minutes on that thing without interruptions, without any distractions, right? As soon as the timer goes up, you stop, you take a 5-minute break, and you repeat this. Like I think 4 times you repeat this, then you take a longer break. And apparently, for many people, this works very well, and it significantly increases that productivity. Doesn't work for everybody.
Yeah, okay? I was just about to say, doesn't work for everybody. Yeah. If you are the kind who works better in hyper focus, then don't worry about the Pomodoro technique. Figure out a way to get your hyper focus on demand, and that is different for everyone. But the day you figure it out, you will be able to do deep work better than most people. But if Pomodoro technique is the way for you, go for it. Absolutely.
A generalization of Pomodoro is a technique called time boxing, where you are given certain amount of time to do something and you only do it for that much time, right? You don't just continue working on something until you hit a goal, right? And lots of people swear by time boxing. There are people who have written books saying that time boxing resulted in a 3x increase in productivity in
Yeah.
like a big company and so on. Don't want to get into those details.
Absolutely.
But the most important one, which almost all of you would have heard of, is Agile. Right?
I have
Agile
heard of it.
and Scrum, if you look into those, I mean, this is pretty much the technique which took over the software world in the last 25 years, and slowly it is going into all other areas also. And what it has done is replaced the waterfall technique of long-term planning and goals to like 1 week sprints or 3 week sprints, right?
Give us a quick idea for those who are not in the software industry. What is Agile and what is Scrum?
Basic idea is that instead of planning your product, saying, okay, next 18 months we are going to work on this, and then first month will be this, second month will be this. That's the old style waterfall, right? What Agile says is that break up your work into small chunks, which can be finished in say 1 week.
Okay.
And now make like a large number of 1 week cards. Okay. And then have the user or the customer or whoever you're, right, look at the cards and tell you, well, this one is the most important. I want you to work on this one.
Okay.
So for the next week, you work on that. You do whatever you can in 1 week, right? And you stop.
Okay.
And then repeat this process. Okay, I'm vastly oversimplifying. There is a lot more there, but the basic idea you will notice is that you are converting goal-oriented work into
deadlines, mini deadlines, and actions.
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean, in some sense, you can say that Agile has incorporated and implemented the idea behind this episode. Right?
Okay. And also Karmanyavadhikaraste, because the focus of the week is to work on it and not necessarily worry about the ultimate goal. Yes, you have a goal to aim to, but you're basically focusing on the work in that week. So one thing that is definitely coming out of this is that you do not worry about imperfectionism in this particular scenario.
Yeah.
And that brings up the question, if you're not going to worry about imperfectionism, why isn't this being used more widely?
Well, actually, it is being used widely, just doesn't have that name, right? Like Agile, I already talked about.
Yeah.
Also, there are companies which have become famous for doing things like this. For example, there is a company called Buffer, which during COVID switched to a 4-day work week, right?
Okay.
But they were expected to do the same amount of work in 4 days instead of 5 days. Right?
Oh.
You would expect that either people wouldn't be able to complete, or they would have to work longer hours, or quality would suffer.
Yeah.
But when they did an analysis later, they found that none of this happened. Productivity actually increased without an increase in time, right?
Ooh.
Which is exactly what we are talking about in this episode happened. And as a result, Buffer has switched permanently to a 4-day work week. Okay.
Interesting.
Other companies, a whole bunch of other companies are doing that. But mostly you will notice that these are mid-sized companies.
Correct.
Problem with this whole technique, right, is that balancing the inverted U, right, staying there, it's sort of not an easy equilibrium, right? People tend to slip off there. It is difficult to manage in larger organizations because bad managers will invariably
push people off the edge into the right-hand side of the inverse U.
Right. But when you have good managers, this is a great technique to use. And for most people, you are a pretty good manager of you. So you should use deadlines on yourself.
Yeah, and most ADHD affected people or people living with ADHD already use deadlines, which is why a lot of them end up working last minute. Everybody knows the last minute panic, and people with ADHD don't have last minute panic. They have last minute plans.
Yeah.
So yeah, deadlines do work. I do agree on that aspect of it for sure.
Yeah. So just to summarize the point of this episode, right? Most importantly, give yourself less time, right?
Yeah.
Also, if possible, make public commitments of your deadlines, right?
Important.
Yeah. This forces you to overcome your perfectionism. It gives you that little bit of stress necessary for focus and for reducing the scope, right?
Yeah.
And like we have mentioned multiple times in previous episodes, we do have a deadline for each other, and that's how all our episodes get done. And pretty much like Tina Fey said, Our episodes don't get done because they're ready and the script is good and everything is perfect. They get done because it is Thursday, right?
Because
So-
it is Thursday.
Another thing with the public deadline commitment is that when you complete it and you let it be known publicly that I have done it, your brain gets a little dopamine reward, right? So another way to use this whole thing is that when you ask someone, right, clearly communicate a deadline to them, right? If possible, make it a little challenging, but not too challenging, and be open to negotiation, right? You want to give them a little stress, but not too much stress.
Not to the point where they burn out. And if watching this episode has given you stress on how to set the right kind of deadlines and what to focus on and where to aim yourself, don't worry. We have an episode for you in which we've spoken about how winners and losers both have goals, which is why goals is not the right answer. The right answer is something else, which you can check out in the episode we have lined up for you. Shrikant, Naveen, Future IQ.